Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody. This is Brent Robbins, professor at Point Park University, past president of Division 32, and delighted to be here with two of my doctoral students at Point Park University presenting on the metabletics of sexuality and gender. And so let me introduce Cris Wildman and Ana Wilhelm. Would you like to say anything about yourselves, Cris or Ana? No? Okay. You don't have to. They'll be presenting on their topics after I give just a general overview of metabletics. So the topic is metabletics applied to issues around sexuality and gender. Two different topics. Cris Wildman touching on the trans movement and looking at that from a metabletics perspective, and Ana looking at Catholic sexuality within Catholic culture and the guilt associated with that, and looking at that from a social perspective. And both of them are speaking on topics that are going to be developed into their dissertations in process at this time. So I'm going to give, for those of you who are new to metabletics, I'm going to give a general introduction to metabletics, which will help contextualize the presentations that are coming after. So when we talk about metabletics, we're situating a phenomenological approach that goes back to the Dutch school of phenomenology and the Dutch psychiatrist Jan Hendrik van den Berg. He often goes by J.H. van den Berg. And there's an interesting connection between the Dutch school of psychiatry and phenomenology and Duquesne University, because Duquesne University was founded by the Puritans, which was a religious order that came from the Dutch, and so they got sort of transplanted to the United States at Duquesne University. And Father Adrian van Kam was a Dutch priest who was a Puritan, and he was the one that started the programs at Duquesne University with the phenomenological and existential approach, both the philosophy program and the psychology program. So we really have Father van Kam to thank for sort of bringing phenomenology and existentialism to American psychology, because there really was no place to study it until that happened in the 1960s. And then you have people like Amadeo Giorgi and Robert Romanishin and Scott Churchill, a lot of the people that we are major movers and shakers in the field, had their start at Duquesne. And so there's a sort of a kind of Dutch flavor to Duquesne phenomenology, and van den Berg is a big part of that. So who are the major influences on van den Berg? MC Rumke was a phenomenological psychiatrist. Van den Berg ultimately was a psychiatrist. He was especially interested in understanding neuroses and how neuroses change over time and are culturally and historically situated. There were the Dutch phenomenologists Buitendijk and Lagerveld were developmental psychologists, and they took a phenomenological approach to childhood and development, and you can see how that shapes and influences van den Berg's work. A major influence was Heidegger's Being in Time, and the way Heidegger understands the history of being and Dasein, or the human kind of being, is something that was foundational for van den Berg, as well as other phenomenologists like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. But he, in terms of contemporaries who were working in parallel with him, van den Berg has acknowledged kinship, although he wasn't directly influenced by them. He doesn't think he influenced them. They were kind of working independently. He sees a kinship with Foucault, which anybody who's familiar with Foucault won't be surprised by that, because there's a similar kind of genealogical historical approach. And then Thomas Kuhn, who looks at science from a constructivist perspective, historically, like the history of science from a constructionist perspective, and it's where we get the term paradigm shift from. And also Eric Fromm, Karen Horney, and so on. We can name a lot of different people. In terms of who Vandenberg has impacted. Again, going back to Duquesne, you have Dr. Ava Maria Sims, who wrote The Child in the World, which is a book that takes a phenomenological approach to childhood. And when I was at Duquesne, I studied with Ava, and she sent me down into the bowels of the library, which is the Simon Silverman Phenomenology Center, and told me to find everything I could find on, phenomenology of childhood and development for her graduate class. And she said there wasn't very much out there, and she didn't think I'd probably find anything, but see what I could come up with. So I ended up spending a good part of the semester just digging around down there, and ended up coming up with like a huge pile of stuff. It was like I came up with a giant box. I was, here we go, I have a boom, and just like put it down. And all of the stuff that I found, most of it came from the Dutch school. It came from Lageveld and Buitendijk, and some of it from Vandenberg. And so Ava sort of took that sort of Dutch school of phenomenology and metabletics and phenomenology of children's life world, and she develops a book, which I think is the definitive book on phenomenology of childhood, in my opinion. So that's one example of someone who sort of took Vandenberg's approach in a Dutch phenomenology and has developed a really innovative approach to studying children. Somebody who was a big influence on me, and I think a lot of people at Duquesne, was an alumni of Duquesne who studied there in the 1970s, Robert D. Romanishin, who went on to the University of Dallas and helped to start the doctoral program that they had there for a while. And then he went to Pacifica Graduate Institute, where he's emeritus faculty, and then now is retired. But he continues to write. He just came out with a new book on Victor Frankenstein and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and which, if you've read Technology, A Symptom and Dream, won't be surprising, because Frankenstein is a trope that's like runs throughout his work. But he basically takes an approach to metabletic phenomenology and applies it to looking at technology in a kind of interesting integration of a kind of metabletic phenomenology and like a depth psychology in a more psychoanalytic tradition, really a kind of Jungian way of reading history that's informed by Vandenberg. And I think it's one of my favorite books of all time, because he's able to sort of take us through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, but does this kind of psychoanalytic reading of how technology has sort of changed how we understand ourselves in the world, and not necessarily for the better. So there's Romanishin. Then there's Bertha Mook, who's another developmental psychologist like Ava Sims. She's at University of Ottawa, and she's applied Vandenberg's approach to neurosis and childhood. For a while, she was one of the editors of a journal called Metabletica, which was a journal dedicated to metabletics, and that they did that for about 10 years or so, and then just recently they decided to end that. My own work, I think, probably best represented in my book that I published in 2018, The Medicalized Body and Anesthetic Culture, is a metabletic approach to understanding how the body comes to be understood within modern medicine, and how that has changed culture, right? Medicine changes our understanding of the body, and that in turn has an influence on how we think about ourselves and each other and the world. There's Michael Cibiora at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He studied with Romanishin and was my dissertation chair, and continues to apply metabletics in his own work. Todd DuBose at Chicago School of Professional Psychology has churned out several student dissertations, chaired several dissertations on metabletics, and continues to teach it at Chicago School. In South Africa, there's a whole Dutch phenomenology connection there through a guy named Dreyer Kruger. And so if you're looking at the literature and you're like, oh, there's this metabletic phenomenology, and it's like Johannesburg, and you're like, that's interesting. They're doing metabletics in Johannesburg. Well, yeah, that's because that's like a hub. And some of you who might be familiar with the faculty at Duquesne you might know about Roger Brooke. And Roger Brooke is from South Africa, and he studied with Dreyer Kruger. That's how he ended up at Duquesne. So Dreyer Kruger is big on metabletics. At one point, he edited a whole volume on metabletics, like back in the 80s or 90s. I don't remember exactly when it was published. And he's still kicking around and has a lot of students that have interestingly dispersed internationally. So there's some that are still in South Africa, but Roger Brooks here in the United States. Les Todres is in the UK. So there, the seeds of metabletics are sort of being dispersed all over the world now. So metabletics continues to be still a somewhat obscure discipline, but it's less obscure in the sense that very similar kinds of work were done by the French phenomenologists and some German phenomenologists. And so there's affinity between work like being done in the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and Foucault and so on. So let's talk a little bit about how do we define what metabletics is. The term comes from the Greek, which means to change. And so the basic idea is that what we're studying is the changing nature of humanity. Vandenberg uses the word man, but that's sexist. So we'll use the more neutral term, humanity. We can forget Vandenberg. He was writing like in the 30s and 40s. So we'll grant him his own historical context. Bertha Mook, you can see her definition of metabletics here. And the quote is covered up by, how do I see read the quote underneath? I can move everybody. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So here's the quote from Bertha Mook. So metabletics can be described as the systematic study of the changing nature of phenomena of human life as they're lived and experienced. It addresses and explores human existence as given in relationships within a specific historical and social cultural context. It deals with things, with adults and children, with men and women, and with their relationships to God. Human existence is seen as a whole and as a matrix of meaningful relationships. That's a pretty good definition. So I'll leave that there. It kind of speaks for itself. It has a psychological focus, of course, because metabletics is psychological application of phenomenology to understand the changing nature of the psyche, but it's inherently interdisciplinary because basically the argument is that the psyche can't be separated from its social, historical, and cultural context. And so if we want to understand the changing nature of the person, we have to study how the person is nested in relationships with all these other disciplines and cultural artifacts and activities. And that's what I love about metabletics is, you get to be very interdisciplinary and bring in, you learn about all these things outside of your discipline, another way to think about it is that it maps the Heideggerian shift from an intrapsychic understanding of the person, the person's soul sort of inside their skull, which is very Cartesian, to the idea of being in the world. Where being in the world entails the person's appropriation of a cultural historical horizon of meaning as a way of understanding themselves and others and things and their interrelations. Beth, I'm not going to go too much into detail, but there's a nice paper that was published in Janus Head where Beth Mook outlines a kind of methodology for metabletics. There's never a point where Vandenberg lays out his methodology. He just kind of does it, so she looks at what he does and then tries to extract a kind of methodology for it. So she outlines in her paper certain theoretical principles and practical principles. So essentially you want to study moments in history where our understanding of the psyche changes by looking at it from an interdisciplinary perspective. You want to do that in a way that's not anachronistic, sort of, stupidly imposing, frameworks of understanding of today onto the past, right? And that's part of the fun of doing a metabletics is you start to discover, if you do it carefully and well, you start to discover how very different that world was to our world today, and that in itself is kind of illuminating. The principle of reality. So according to Vandenberg, reality is really what equivalent to what Husserl would call the life world, or what Heidegger would call being in the world. It's not, it's reality as it's understood prior to the abstract concept of subjectivity and objectivity, right? It's the world as it's given to embodied lived experience. And when we pay attention to that kind of experience, then it's an experience that's constantly undergoing transformation, change, and development over time. And so if you want to look for changes in those moments where there's profound changes in our understanding of ourselves and the psyche, we can look for synchronicities. We can look for changes across a number of different disciplines all at the same time. And then we can look at a unique event that sort of pulls together those different threads and make sense of them. And then once we do that, we can look at the principle of emphasis would focus on details of particular discoveries or insights or new concepts that emerge, and study them in depth to understand this larger cultural shift that's happening and how that's part of that shift. So that Ashley Boback is presenting in another presentation. I think her dissertation is a really good illustration of the principle of synchronicity, because she in unique event and emphasis, because she was studying the medicalization of addiction, and she found that at the same time addiction was being medicalized and being talked about as a degenerative brain disease, the theme of degeneration was appearing in literature in the decadence movement, and it was appearing in physics under the concept of entropy. So you have three different disciplines all at the same time talking about degeneration. Even there's also a cult, there's a popularization of the occult and the esoteric in the publication of a book called The Spirit Book and there's this interesting discourse on sort of degeneration that's going on in the occult that she draws upon as well. So you can see in three different disciplines, all with publications in 1847, all in the same year, you get the same theme that cuts across all of them. So you have this moment of synchronicity. Then she was able to trace these back to certain unique events that were happening at that time and emphasize them and sort of amplify them to help understand the larger thematic relationship between these events. Some illustrations. So that's one illustration. Some other illustrations. Whoops. And Vandenberg talks about the divided and complex society and the emergence of childhood and adolescence, as well as the concepts of neurosis and the Freudian unconscious. He talks about interrelations among the Renaissance and Enlightenment developments, linear perspective technique in art, anatomy and medicine, politics, theology, and objectivist epistemology of modern science, and showing how all of those are undergoing very similar shifts all around the same time. And then metabletics, mainly Romanician, Scipiora, and now I have begun talking about metabletics as a cultural therapeutics, as a deconstructing, a reappropriating, and re-narrativizing of the past in the service of the future in order to discover foreclosed possibilities. So think of it as like a psychoanalysis of the culture, so that you're unlocking sort of repressed unconscious of the culture in order to open up future possibilities that have been foreclosed. But instead of working with the person individually in psychoanalysis, you're working with the culture, but you're using very similar kind of techniques. I like that. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about how metabletics follows very similar principles to Freud's work in interpretation of dreams. And that's all I'll say about that now, because that could be, I could go on for 20 minutes talking just about that. So I will end there. That gives everybody just a broad overview of metabletics. And so I'm going to punt to Cris to take it over from there.
Awesome, thank you. So I didn't prepare a PowerPoint. I'm just going to talk a little bit about my dissertation project. So I'm currently in the process of putting together my proposal and sort of just starting the basic foundations. So my dissertation project is a metabletic study of the factors involved at both sort of like cultural and then also like individual psychological levels, in the process of moving from a reparative approach to psychological treatment with transgender or gender nonconforming children, to an affirmative approach. So this was something that I wrote a paper on, I think for a psychopathology class, because I have always sort of been interested in the experiences of transgender and gender nonconforming children as a research area. And so I wrote my paper sort of just covering the differences between the reparative approaches and the affirmative approach, and then sort of going over the evidence of the impacts of each, and making the case that we need to continue working towards affirmative approaches on the basis that reparative approaches aren't particularly effective and also tend to create significant distress and even like psychological harm down the road for people that are subjected to it. So just briefly, I'm going to go over some of the history of that, sort of to situate where my project is coming in. So the reparative approach, some people would argue that this term is not fair to use for therapies that sought to basically correct children who were presenting as transgender or gender nonconforming, given that reparative therapy is a term that has a very specific origin. However, I think that it is warranted given both the connections between people who were aiming to enact reparative therapies with people who are gay or lesbian. Many of those people are also in the same sort of like circles as the people that were doing this sort of work with transgender and gender nonconforming children, and were, you know, citing each other. And then on the other hand, the outcomes of both attempts to change sexual orientation and gender identity seem to be very similar. And so I think it is warranted to call them reparative approaches. So for the majority of the history of our field, this has been the dominant approach. Transgender individuals and like transsexuality, as it was originally termed, weren't actually very prominent in the DSM for a long time. Most of the adults who presented with these issues were sort of lumped in with like homosexuals or anyone else with some sort of like paraphilia, since there's sort of this very long history of sort of conflation of gender nonconformity and not being straight. And so for a very long time, that was just sort of the assumption. It's like, you know, maybe you're just like actually gay. And it actually wasn't until homosexuality was removed from the DSM that we first see a specific disorder related to transgender and like gender nonconformity, which was the original diagnosis was gender identity disorder, which had separate criteria for adults and adolescents, and then a separate diagnosis for children, based on the opinion of the people that were prominent in the field, that often if someone was still presenting with like a persistent declaration of a desire to live as another gender than the one they were assigned, by the time they reached puberty, then most likely they would end up being a transgender adult. And so at that point, by the time we reach the 60s, the 70s, especially after the removal of homosexuality, most of the sort of like forefront people in the field who are working with transgender adults supported helping them transition as sort of the most effective course of action. However, when it came to children, the approach was still to try to make them gender nonconform, or to make them gender conforming. So some of the premises of this was essentially that being transgender or gender nonconforming was pathological, and that if we have the opportunity to do so when someone is a child, that we should attempt to correct that. And this is all sort of working from a social modeling theory of gender identity development, which sort of holds that gender identity is pretty malleable up until a certain age, and that most of how this is developed has to do with modeling from those around us, especially parents and peers. So the goal of treatment would be to make the children conform to the gender they were assigned, and some of the methods that this used would be essentially attempts to correct the improper modeling. So take away any toys, clothing, etc., related to the other gender, reward and encourage gender conforming appearance and behavior, emphasizing spending time with the parents of the same gender, doing gender conforming activities, and also encouraging peer relationships with children of the same gender with, traditionally gender stereotype behaviors. And this was the dominant model for a very long time. I think the last paper that I read on a research study of one of these forms of treatment was from 2000. And so it was only in, I would say, starting around that time, maybe like the late 2000s, early 2010s, that we begin to see a transition away from this approach for several reasons. One is that this sort of treatment was often experienced by the children who were subjected to it as shameful and very painful. And there's also increasing evidence that attempts to change someone's gender identity results in the same sort of harm that we see with attempting to change sexual orientation. So the person who is sort of the big name and like my hero when it comes to the affirmative approach for working with transgender and gender nonconforming children is Diane Aronsaft. And she got involved in this work because her second child, her son, was very feminine from noticeably by the age of about 2. And so when he was, a little kid, she took him to a therapist because she was a psychologist. And she's like, this is, what my field and all my training says that we do. Like, you take them here. And the therapist's recommendations were essentially take away all of his feminine toys and clothing. Don't let him play with female children, which included his sister that he was very close with. Try to make him join stereotypical masculine peer activities. And essentially, she couldn't do it. She tried, and it was very obvious that this was like distressful. That's not a word. Distressing to her child. And that was deeply painful. It was negatively impacting their relationship. It was making her son feel very ashamed. And essentially, it was just painful for the entire family. And so she sort of decided, like, we have to do something different. We need to sort of find a different approach. So the basic premise of the affirmative approach to working with transgender and gender nonconforming children is that being gender nonconforming or transgender is not pathological. Gender variance or diversity is normal. And so as a result of this, there is no sort of desired outcome for children who are working with affirmative therapists. It depends on the child. Some of them may go on to identify as transgender. Some may continue to just identify as gender nonconforming. Some may go on to be gender conforming. Some may go on to be gay or lesbian. Essentially, there's a whole variety of options, and it's really about the individual child. So the focus of treatment is really helping children sort of explore their own individual genders. Aaron Saft uses the concept of like a gender web that each of us sort of creates that ties together like our own sort of like innate sense of like how we fit with the options that our culture presents, as long as along with like sort of like specific familial, cultural, and social threads, to sort of arrive at like an individual like gender that is us. And so treatment is just based on sort of helping kids clarify that and sort that out, as well as helping families navigate some of the tensions that can come up at the familial, relational, social, and institutional levels with their kids. So that's sort of where we're at today. The affirmative approach is, I would say, definitely gaining traction. And reparative approaches have definitely become sort of outdated, although there probably are still people who support them. Although most recently, APA passed a resolution last year against the practice of efforts to change gender identity. So I think that's a good step towards moving away from those practices. And then at the broader cultural level, there's sort of a similar sort of like tension and movement. We're beginning to see, increasing visibility and acceptance for transgender and gender nonconforming children, although there is simultaneously a tremendous amount of backlash. I think there's about 50 or so laws being proposed across the country that target trans people, and many of them target trans children. For instance, Texas actually recently, their attorney general wrote an opinion stating that under Texas law, any sort of medical transitioning for children constitutes child abuse. And so the Department of Family Services is supposed to not only report any parents that they're aware of who are, allowing their children to access puberty blockers, hormone replacement therapies, or any form of surgeries for child abuse. They're also being ordered to investigate any parents who potentially could be doing so. There are reporting requirements as well as legal consequences for anyone who has contact with children professionally. So doctors, teachers, I believe therapists are included. And then there are also similar reporting and consequences for the general public. So we are definitely in what I see as sort of like a watershed moment where it really could go either way. Yes, there's increasing visibility and support for trans kids, but there's also a significant amount of backlash. And so the discourse is very full of sort of, say, a lot of not always accurate opinions or understandings of what's happening with these children. Very little sort of really understanding of like who they are. And so given that this is sort of like this moment of sort of a lot of tension and debate, the sort of like inspiration for my dissertation project was to sort of learn about the sort of like factors and sort of like broad, as like Brent says, like tropes that were happening that allowed the field of psychology specifically, and then also our culture more generally, to move from reparative to affirmative approaches, in the hopes that this will sort of, allow us to get some clues as to how to continue moving towards sort of like a more accepting and supportive future, both as like in the field of psychology and also in our culture more broadly. Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Okay, thank you, Cris. We might have time in the end for discussion, so but let's move on to Ana. and her presentation. And you have a PowerPoint, right? Good.
Yeah. Not as extensive as yours, but I do have one. Yes. Okay. Let me pull it up. There. Is that coming up okay? Okay, there we go. Okay, hi everyone. As Brent kind of already said, I'm Anna. I'm a third-year doctoral student at Point Park, and I prepared a little presentation today on the metabolic analysis of sex and Catholicism. Okay, so before I begin kind of outlining my findings regarding this area of exploration, I'd kind of like to take a quick moment to contextualize the importance that I attribute to the metabletic approach and how I view it as a research tool. I think Brent gave a really great kind of background information and kind of foundational understanding of metabletics kind of as an emerging practice. But I also wanted to take a moment to kind of talk about how I interact with metabletics, the importance that I've found with it in terms of my own research, and kind of just my outlook on people and kind of viewing humanity more in a holistic sense. So when conducting research and studies, especially ones that you're really passionate about, I've found that it's really easy to find yourself fully immersed in your work and all that comes with it. And through the seamlessly seemingly endless transcribing. There it is. Transcribing, meeting with participants, conducting research on the topic. It can feel really easy, as though you and your project are almost the epicenters of knowledge and relevance concerning your topic of choice. But I found that when you allow this mindset to shape how you view the progress of your work, it often prohibits you from recognizing a really crucial factor, in that nothing exists in a vacuum, especially humanity in the development of it. Therefore, it's really necessary to view things holistically to help put into perspective that these issues are bigger than just ourselves or one research topic or research study, that the world is so much more interconnected than we sometimes give it credit for. This makes our actions and the actions of others more powerful and impactful than we understand. And it's when we ignore the importance and impact of our actions that a sense of division becomes perpetuated due to our lack of recognition of the parts that we play in instilling a sense of community and responsibility. So when the interconnectedness of the world is ignored, the overall quality and understanding that the researcher has so painstakingly compiled, I've found sometimes becomes slightly compromised. There can be no truth or true enlightenment regarding a research topic without the acknowledgement of how it has been invariably shaped and influenced by the happenings of the world around it. Therefore, through the use of the metabolic analysis, which hones in on a certain topic and attempts to connect it to other concurrent shifts in culture, no matter how innocuous or disconnected they may seem on the outside, the researchers then asked to really check your ego at the door in order to see the connections that exist all around us. They're ultimately contributors to a field of knowledge rather than the pioneers or creators. So the topic that I will be focusing on, and I did focus on for this kind of brief metabolic analysis that I'm going to share with you guys, is focused more on the more modern social concept of Catholic guilt, particularly in how guilt and shame manifest themselves in an individual in regards to sex and intimacy. So I chose to analyze the growth and evolution of this topic through the lens of the 1960s, which was a time rife with transitions in many different fields, such as medically, religiously, and culturally. And I focus specifically in this presentation as it pertains to the civil rights movement. I intend to thoughtfully analyze the effects that these shifts had within the societal culture of that time, and highlight how they interacted with and are influenced by each other to create a reinforcing contribution to the guilt and shame one may experience due to their upbringing within the Catholic Church to this day. So, as a potential impact of an individual's internalized shame and or guilt may have on their relationship with sex, While that is the intended research topic for my dissertation, the metabletic analysis that I will be presenting is meant more so to serve as a small snapshot of the complexities and nuances to this topic that I am still in the process of exploring. Okay, so the three kind of major areas of change that I focused on. The first area of change that I kind of explored and found some really interesting stuff regarding was in the medical field. So in terms of progressions that were being made in the medical field, I became very interested around the creation of the first pacemaker. So that was became more popularized in 1958 and was quickly followed by the first implantable pacemaker that was created within the same year. The first durable and implantable pacemaker that actually lasted until the natural death of the patient was made in 1960. So kind of the beginning of this era that I'm focusing on. And it became the first pacemaker that was ever implanted was in America, I think around 1961. So throughout the 1960s, further advancements to the functionality and efficiency of the pacemaker were made in the US and throughout the world. This introduction of such an invasive yet life-saving scientific development showcased a major shift in the public's understanding and perception of the extent that medical practices could have to help preserve a life, that the human body can accept support from a man-made object to not only function, but perform at a greater capacity than the body itself was originally capable of. You know, this acceptance is something that I found really interesting, was a really far cry from how the public originally acted to the pacemaker in 1932, which is when publications kind of outlining how the pacemaker would be constructed, how it would function, and how it would, work once implanted in the body. These publications were actually put on hold due to the public's outcry and condemnation of the device, with people stating that it was interfering with human life, and the pacemaker itself was viewed as an unnatural device meant to bring people back from the dead. So here you can see that technology, was viewed almost in fear, and also this condemnation of, they referred to individuals that the pacemaker would help almost as zombies. It was messing with the natural order of life and how things were supposed to be. And then I found the public acceptance, that started to highlight the transition kind of that it was beginning in the 1960s, aimed at modernization and evolution of practices and concepts in all fields. And additionally, this serves to showcase the public becoming more comfortable with the presence of medical advancements and the implementation of such devices, even within very intimate central aspects of the human body, such as the heart. There's medical shifts in terms of how the heart was viewed, kind of also reflecting like the social shifts of, how the heart would be viewed. So another area that I focused on was social change and social upheaval at the time. So I wanted to highlight the civil rights movement, since it's a prime example of people not only demanding, but actively working towards a reconstruction within our society in terms of how we view and treat our members of it. To many, this movement felt extremely revolutionary, as it pushed against injustices and prejudices that had become so extremely embedded within our society that it was almost viewed as a normal way of life. An example of this desire for change and discontentment with the societal structure of the times can be found in the 1960 Supreme Court case, Boynton versus Virginia. This case revolved around the previous ruling that an African-American student was trespassing in a whites-only restaurant that was located on a bus terminal. The ruling of Boynton versus Virginia stated that segregation and/or unjust discrimination within interstate public transportation was illegal, and thus led to the subsequent overturning of the court's previous ruling. This ruling not only served as a formal ruling that public transportation was to be free of segregation, but it served as a catalyst for the Freedom Riders protests in 1961, during which both white and Black passengers would ride the local bus systems throughout the South together in protest of segregation. By Deliberately provoking a crisis of authority, the rioters challenged federal officials to enforce the law and uphold constitutional rights to travel without being subjected to degrading and humiliating racial restrictions. So this not only highlights the desire for change that many Americans during this time were feeling, but also their conviction and the determination to fight for what they believe so strongly in. So then the third area that I focused on during this study was kind of the public's relationship with the Catholic Church. Particularly, there was growing uncertainty revolving around the Czech Catholic Church and its stance on contraception during this time. So with feelings of, that I'd previously touched on, of modernization and empowerment brewing within society, the question of contraception and its moral standing within the Catholic Church became an area of interest and potential theological evolution. So a direct example of this line of questioning can actually be seen in 1964, which is when Pope John XIII formed a committee of 11 clergymen, 6 physicians, and 1 economist to draft a response on behalf of the Church to the UN's publicized stances and programs on contraception and population control. When the question of whether or not marital sex could include more than just procreative purposes by one of the priests on the committee was permitted by the Pope to add new members from various fields such as psychology, medicine, and theology to the pursuit to kind of explore more in this pursuit of critically analyzing the Church's stance on human sexuality as a whole and draft ways in which this understanding could eventually evolve, kind of in accordance with, shifting cultural and societal understandings of sexuality. So 2 years later, the committee had actually drafted a recommendation to the Church stating that they should modernize their stance on contraception. This report was actually leaked to the press, which stirred an air of hopefulness amongst many individuals within the Church. That this report was a sign of the Church's flexibility and ability to understand how impactful such a change would be. However, this optimism was ultimately met with disappointment later in 1968 when Pope Paul VI rejected the committee's report in its totality and instead published Humanae Vitae in his response. This denouncement of contraception, coupled with the disappointment of those within the Church that were hoping for these potential adjustments to the Church's teachings, would allow for more seamless integration of, or at least they were hoping that these potential adjustments would allow for more seamless integration of their personal lives, social relationships, and control over their bodies, with their interrelationship with the Church, rather than feeling that these are all conflicting aspects of their lives that they somehow just have to make work the best that they can. With contraception becoming known to help with severe menstrual cramps, mitigating the risk of unwanted pregnancies, and more, the public was beginning to see contraception as a natural, helpful item to integrate into their daily lives, rather than something to wholly condemn. So this subsequent division between their wants and the Church's teachings may have led to feelings of shame or guilt due to the individual's continued desire to try contraception, or potentially due to their continued use of contraception. And I think here you see, as kind of outlined in these 3 subjects, there's this brewing kind of acceptance of technological and social advances. And there was this hopefulness with the Church that was ultimately, halted and really dashed a lot of women and young men's hopes about forming an identity that could be in harmony with the Church's teachings, rather than feeling this inherent sense of guilt or shame that the way they wanted to live their social lives went inherently against what the Church taught as moral or correct. Excuse me. So, here we go. So the 1960s, was a time of personal exploration, modernization, medical innovations, and cultural evolution, a period when it felt as though the world was changing and that anything was possible. This period of growth and general upheaval, when met with resounding rigidity of the Catholic Church, it can create a battle within individuals who feel trapped between the modernizing times and the safety of tradition, and doing what was always considered, at least from a religious standpoint, to be right. This conflict could manifest itself through guilt, shame, a sense of confusion, or self-imposed distance between the self and the relationship with their body and or sexuality. This could lead to questions regarding if personal and spiritual growth are separate things, that if we as individuals are growing, but the church seems to be staying the same, what does that say about us and what does that say about the church? Are we straying from the truth? Are we outgrowing outdated ideas? And if we are outgrowing outdated ideas, how much validity does the church truly have? These questions, especially when mixed with growing normalcy and accepting scientific advancements, more so as daily implementations, a burgeoning determination to fight injustices, as it pertains to civil liberties and personal rights, all of that mixed with a sense of disappointment in the apparent stagnation of the church's stances on these topics, these all can merge into an existential conflict regarding how we should or how we can live our lives and under whose authority. Such questions that the 1960s and this time period were really highlighting these questions are really highlighting like a dichotomy of societal and religious values. This could understandably create a deep internal conflict within individuals who feel as though they are caught between such values, producing an increased sense of shame or guilt, especially revolving around topics that are considered to be particularly taboo by the church as a result. And so in working, kind of highlighting this analysis and the shifting in, how people were viewing their body, what could enter into their body, their rights, both social, civil, and religious, like that's something that I found to be really helpful to view as a foundational understanding of this approach, and in approaching my dissertation topic. So how I view it now is, working to outline some of the interwoven complexities and influences that exist within our social, cultural, and human development has provided truly an invaluable foundation for my current work and research regarding the intersections between guilt, sex, and Catholicism. There's often a call for separation between church and state within the United States, with few individuals attempting to explore the harsh divide of self and identity that such a separation invariably results in. Growing up within the Catholic Church, which can provide harsh, predictable, moral, and divine standards that each patron is measured against, and usually found to be inherently lacking in some way, can often lead to a confusing and potentially damaging relationship with the chaotic, capitalistic, freer, or I guess more socially liberal and potentially damaging relationship of our society and the culture that reflects it. On either side, shame and judgment can face such an individual, and then which leaves them caught between their growing cultural and religious identities. And somewhere in the mix of that, the mosaic of their identity begins to form, reflecting desires to explore, fear of admonishment, of embarrassment, shame, desire, to explore. There's a curiosity there, and there's so many more experiences and emotions that come from such a complexity and a nuanced identity. Viewing this research topic through a metabletic analysis has truly helped me to instill a foundational dedication to the person and their lived experiences, within the context of the world and in the culture that they are existing in, that I believe will prove to be imperative in my continued research. And that is all I got for you.
Great. Well, I think we've got about 5 minutes. So I'll pose a question to each of you if you just keep it to like 2 minutes in your answers. Okay.
Yeah.
So Cris, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what are some of the historically contingent sort of areas of interest are you going to be looking at in your metabletics? So you're looking at trans as sort of at the center. What are some of the other cultural artifacts or events you're going to be looking at in your analysis?
Yeah, so I love that that was in my outline and I completely forgot to talk about it. So I'm focusing on around the year 2012, because this is when Jazz Jennings became like the first sort of publicly known transgender child. I believe she was about 7 at the time. And she was sort of like the first trans kid that was like on like TV, on social media, and very sort of prominent. You know, there have been a lot of sort of like out and open trans adults in the public eye before that point, but this is the first time that we see a kid. And I think what's really interesting with her is sort of getting to watch her grow up as well. And sort of like seeing how she's developed into like an activist. And then 2012 is also when Diane Ehrensaft, it was 2012 or 2011 when Diane Ehrensaft wrote her first book, which I believe was the Gender Creative Child, or the other one, I'm not sure. But so this time seems to be like sort of a point of change. And so I'm looking at a bunch of different things since I'm just sort of starting. But this is also the year in which Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed. It's also the time of the Occupy movements, as well as the Arab Spring, a lot of medical advances, and sort of some things that like we've talked about as sort of like to keep an eye out for, sort of generally these ideas about the malleability of the body, of personhood, of identity.
Even architecture, right?
Yeah, right. And in architecture. So in all of these ways, something supporting this beginning view of things that's like sort of more plastic and changeable, as opposed to sort of like fixed as they had been in the past.
Awesome, thank you. That was a nice, succinct summary. So Ana, got a couple minutes left. I'm just going to throw a question at you about, so what brought, when your last few comments I thought were interesting, right? This, you're describing a kind of divided self, you know, and Vandenberg wrote the divide. I mean, he saw that as the hallmark of modernity. And that's, he thought neurosis was a purely modern phenomenon because we're living in a divided society.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like you're tapping into a theme that runs in Vandenberg, which is this, what he calls the spiritual unconscious, or, you know, Michael Sipiora picks up on this, but like the kind of within secular society where, you know, you're not supposed to, there's a sphere where you're not supposed to talk about religion and religion and spirituality. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, how do I frame this question? The secularization as being part of the phenomena of conflict, right?
Yeah.
The sphere where there's room to sort of have multiple perspectives on things, and then there's a sphere where your religious community or some other community you belong to, where you have certain commitments, and then the tension between interacting with people who have different views than you and interacting with your faith community seems to be inherent to this structure of the problem you're exploring. Yeah,
and something that I've been coming across kind of in my research and you know, working on my dissertation proposal is that, you know, this split kind of comes in because we largely, especially from a religious standpoint, kind of, I think it's easy to view kind of secular communities and societies as being totally open to talking about these different perspectives, when in reality, there's still a lot of either unspoken or implicit or explicit messaging around what is or isn't acceptable to kind of express, you know. I talk a lot with individuals who there's the split that comes in where in societal kind of circles that they run in, a more cultural expectations, you know, waiting for marriage is something that brings a lot of embarrassment or shame, you know, for a religious individual, because it's not culturally accepted and it's viewed to be very at odds with the expectations that, you know, kind of that pertain to sex and intimacy kind of within our culture now. And then that same person goes to a church function or something like that, and, you know, suddenly how they dress is sexualized, and they're, you know, too promiscuous in one society or one instance, and then a prude in others, and it creates a split of, you know, where does my identity then, where is it allowed? How do I kind of grow in one aspect without leaving the other behind or being, you know, condemned by one or the other?
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, you could see how that Vandenberg's really insightful there, and that he saw neurosis as really being not about something going on inside of us as much as a split happening between two different worlds.
Yeah.
Inhabiting, and an incongruency in the person that results from that. I think that's going to be a good thing to keep in mind as you work on your meditation. Yeah.
I think especially with kind of the omnipresent sense of like, you know, God watching down on you, but then also with the advancement of like technology and cell phones, like you also have those societal and cultural presences constantly with you. And there's never really a moment of respite, like of where you could, as yourself, can exist for a little bit, without these influences.
Another way, interesting way of thinking about that is Artin Lang, when he talks about the schizoid personality, because that's that kind of split between worlds where you're trying to be one person here and another person there can create this, you know, kind of alienated personality. Yeah. All right, awesome. Well, we're out of time, so we'll have to stop. Well, thank you both for doing this. It was a lot of fun and great to hear a summary of your projects, which I'm very excited to be working with you on, and really looking forward to seeing how they develop in the near future. I mean, we're really getting to the point where you're collecting data soon. Defending your dissertations soon after that, so it'll come sooner than you think. Have a great weekend. Good to
Thank you. Bye, guys.